Now, why is it that economists actually think that education is so important? So this is a graph that, well, we might argue with because it depends on literally some of the sample size decisions, but the basic structure of this graph is one thing that, there's how many jokes can we make about economists not disagreeing about things? But this is one graph we all pretty much agree on. And what this graph shows you is the relationship between earnings and education. Now, I chose to do this not in hourly wages, which is what we often will do, but I wanted to make it annual earnings. So annual earnings reflects not only how much you're making per hour, but how many hours you're working, how many weeks you're working during the year as well. And so what you can see is, and then we have to do, this is the current population survey, we have to do a little bit of imputing to get something that I'm calling years of schooling. And what you see is that in the US, until you get to about 11th grade, there's not really much of a relationship. So really, if you're going to drop out, if you're making a decision between 4th and 5th grade of dropping out, not such a big decision. And part of that in the US is because there's just not that many people down here. We're pretty good at getting people at least through middle school. And then we start to have a problem. We could do a whole session on high school. We start to have a problem. It starts to be a bigger group, especially in some cities. But basically, in the US, a good chunk of people at least get to high school. But what you really notice is that starting after we get out of high school, that there's a fairly straight relationship between years of schooling and earnings, and what you're going to earn in the labor market. So economists call this the economic benefit of education. You'll hear us because we want to be technical, we want to play with our capital friends, the rate of return to education. And roughly speaking, it's on the order of magnitude, just because I'm really bad with specific numbers, of 10% per year of additional schooling. And yes, there's sort of plus or minus around that, but it's really interesting that that's the number we tend to come up with. So now many people have taken issue. This is the reason why economists actually tend to agree about this graph is because we've studied it so much. So a lot of concerns, and I'll come back to this a little bit as people are complaining about our post-secondary system. So one of the obsessions in economics for many years was, what does this really mean? Meaning, is this relationship causal? Meaning that if I force everybody to get an extra year of college, if I make 1 year of college compulsory, say, where everybody has to do 1 year of college, can everybody expect to see their income go up by 10%? So is it the education that's making people more productive so that employers are willing to pay more, willing to hire them, willing to pay them more if they're working for them? Or is it that the people who go to college would have earned that much anyway? In other words, are they different than the people who choose not to go to college? So this has been such an important question. In economics, 2 Nobel Prizes have been awarded for this. So we had Gary Becker, who won a Nobel Prize for human capital. And that's the school of thought that says actually it's the education that's making you more productive, or it's having an impact on the outcomes. So if you're a policy person, that's important, because if you're going to have a policy that gets people to have more schooling, then we think that policy is going to have an impact. And then you had Michael Spence, who had an alternative interpretation, which we call signaling, which was saying that actually what happens is that there are 2 different types of people, roughly speaking, those who are really productive and those who are not so productive. Those who are more productive innately find going to school a little easier, so they're going to so it's easier for them to go to school, and employers therefore then use the fact that they went to school as a signal. It's just telling them, it's a stamp that says, oh, you were productive. The problem from the policy perspective is if that's all that's happening, there might be a cheaper way to distinguish who's productive and who's not than an expensive 4-year college education or something like that. So there have been many attempts to distinguish these 2 theories. I think many of the attempts to distinguish them, there's always a theorist that can tell you could interpret one the other way too. But let me tell you some of the ways that we've tried to distinguish them. One is by looking at identical twins. So identical twins, until the point where the egg splits. It says one fertilized egg that splits at some point. Until they split, they're identical. After they split, they're not. Even in utero, one might get more resources than the other. But nonetheless, they're pretty close together. They share the same DNA. And importantly, even in their family environment, they're growing up in a similar family environment. Siblings may not, less so. If the siblings are 5, 6, 7 years apart, the parents actually may be in very different situations between one child and another. Identical twins going through at the same rate. What happens when we look at identical twins? Rates of return of about 10% per year. Another way people have looked at it is, well, we don't compel people to go to college, but we do have compulsory schooling laws at high school. We have these around the world. People have looked at these in several countries. And when you see that the compulsory schooling age is raised, you see people who are compelled to go to school for longer, again, a rate of return in terms of the labor market about 10%. So many economists, Mike Spence even was visiting us last year, can see that actually there's a good portion of this graph which is likely causal. Does that mean that there's no signaling component to going to Wharton or going to University of Pennsylvania? There's probably some. But that a good portion of it is also causal. So you can call home to your parents and tell them this probably was a good idea. So in that graph, I showed you the impact in terms of annual earnings. Underlying that is not only what you get paid per hour, but also your likelihood of getting a job. And you can see that your likelihood of getting a job, the flip side of that is what are the unemployment rates by levels of education. So, and what I wanted to contrast here is December 2007 was right before the start of the recession. And I just wanted to make it December to December, so I took out a little cyclicality, so went back to December 2012. So you can see that, and this is ages 25 plus, which is why these numbers are going to look a little bit lower than the numbers that you'll see from if you were to go to BLS and just read it right off the chart. So you can see that in December 2007, the unemployment rate was 3.8%. In December 2012, it was 6.5. What I really want to bring your attention to is two things on this graph. One is the fact that for both the blue bars and the orange bars, that the unemployment rates are much higher for those who have lower levels of schooling. The other point that I want to bring your attention to is during the recession, we had the same pattern. And one of the things that characterized this recession was that actually this bar roughly doubled. Typically in recessions, those who have a college degree aren't as affected by much. It is my humble opinion, which is why this gave rise to why many people felt that, or I was going to say gave rise to the Occupy Wall Street, but you know, many people felt like, oh my gosh, really college isn't worth it anymore, because in this recession, you know, it started in the financial sector. Who's employed in the financial sector? People who have some education. But that they were affected in a way that if we look at earlier recessions, they were not. But if you compare that to what would have happened with lower levels of schooling, it still looks pretty good. So education is, in the health world, they use the term protective, right? So education is somewhat protective against adverse shocks to the economy as well. That's because they're more likely to be employed, so they're less likely to be unemployed. And if we were to look at other outcomes that economists have looked at in terms of benefits of education, so I've gone in terms of the better employment. If you look at other forms of compensation that employers give in terms of health benefits, retirement benefits, parking benefits, other forms of benefits that employers give in their employment relationship, there's a return to these other benefits. There's a growing literature on the impact of education on health. There's literature on the impact on crime. People have more years of schooling are less likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to believe in free speech. They pay more in taxes. That's related to the income. And then there's relatively new work by Enrico Moretti at Berkeley, which also shows that cities that have higher proportions of educated workers also have higher wages for people in general, suggesting that there are spillovers between those who have more education and other workers. So this is to say that there are a lot of private benefits to increase schooling, and there are some social benefits as well. So this is why, you know, economists and policymakers and all can agree that education is something we can all get behind. We may not agree how, but we all believe in more education, and it is an important component to growth. If we were to look forward, we think things are likely to change. This is a chart that I did actually at the CEA, and I haven't updated it, although I think the relationships are still the same, but it's very nice. So this is work that was done by David Otter and Richard Murnane and Frank Levy, who are up at, is Frank Levy still, is he at Brown now? Anyway, and Harvard, MIT, possibly Brown, where they looked at which occupations are growing and which are declining. And if you think about our growing world, which is getting smaller because, you know, of easy transportation, it's easy for jobs to be overseas. And the fact that, you know, as we adopt technology, what are the things that are easy to, where we can replace labor, L with K capital, things that are routinized, in particular, a machine can do it, or you can program up a computer to do it. What they have found is that they looked at a bunch of occupations, they categorized the types of tasks that were required for those occupations into non-routine analytic, non-routine interactive, routine cognitive, non-routine manual, and routine manual. And basically what you can see is those occupations that are growing are those occupations that require skills that are non-routine. Those are the skills that are not easily replaced with technology or with a computer. The occupations that are growing less quickly are those that are easily replaced with technology. So this is a struggle for our educational system, but it also is correlated. This is not necessarily causal, but if you can see a correlation between the jobs that are fastest growing in terms of their tasks and the jobs that the BLS projects will be the fastest growing as well, which tend to be the ones that have require or more associated with higher levels of schooling as well. So this is my long connect the dots pitch for why, when we look forward, if we look at where, so we know that there's this relationship that exists today between schooling and earnings, etc. If we look forward, I believe it's going to continue.